Welcome to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio, bringing you insights and strategies to help you create a magnificent and fulfilling second half of life. Here's your host, certified professional retirement coach and best-selling author, Dr. Dorian Mintzer.
I want to welcome everybody to the fourth Tuesday Revolutionize Your Retirement Interview with Expert series. I'm Dorian Mintzer, owner of Revolutionize Retirement and your host for today. So now let me just shift gears and introduce you to George Schofield, who I met, I can't remember how long ago, but I met George at the Positive Aging conferences, probably over the years. George is a native of Seattle, but lives now in Florida, near both Sarasota and Brandon, Florida. His new book, as he mentioned, How Do I Get There From Here? Planning for Retirement When the Old Rules No Longer Apply, is scheduled for release in July 2017. And the book focuses on planning for retirement when the old rules no longer apply. And his groundbreaking book is After 50, It's Up to Us, Developing the Skills and Agility We'll Need. And it very eloquently explains why and how we all must face head-on the new realities that await us as we age. George appears weekly on a Focus 50 Plus, which is a TV series on SNN, Sarasota News Network. He has a BA in business, an MA in counseling rehabilitation, a master's in adult learning, human and organizational development, and a PhD in human and organizational development. He's also an organizational psychologist and practicing entrepreneur. I love that expression, practicing entrepreneur. He's the founding principal of the Clarity Group, LLC, which is a consultancy that helps businesses succeed in the 21st century and helps individuals and couples create new and accelerated professional lives. And his website, for those of you who are interested in it, is www.clarity-group.com. And his other website is www.georgeschofield, GeorgeSchofield.com. He's been an adjunct faculty member in the College of Education and an adjunct faculty appointment for the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Florida, Sarasota, Manatee. His articles have appeared in the Huffington Post, Forbes.com, PBS Next Avenue, Credit.com, and others. And he's been quoted in major publications, including the New York Times, BBC, RP, Credit.com, and the U.S. News and World Report. So, George, I am so delighted to have you with us today. And
Thank you.
Thanks. And I know it's a busy week before Thanksgiving, so I am thankful for you being here and everybody who's part of the call. So maybe why don't we start with you talking some about how you got interested in retirement to begin with. That's okay with you?
That's a shaggy dog story. Let me see if I can say that quickly. I never expected to be a divorced man raising two sons by myself from the ages of 3 and 7. When the boys were taller than I was, and it was clear they were going to go away, I realized for the first time I hadn't a clue who I was going to be or what kind of a life I wanted for myself. I was then in my middle 40s, probably. That set a frame for me because we all go through transitions, whether they're voluntary or involuntary work transitions, whether they're voluntary or involuntary marital transitions, health transitions. So I became really interested in voluntary and involuntary transitions and what it takes to do them successfully.
I resonate so much with that because I've been interested in transitions, and it is amazing how certain life events just catapult us into saying, who am I?
Right.
What's this all about? It sounds like that really happened for you.
Yes, it did. More than once.
More than once. And you've stayed interested in this area.
I have.
Since then. What has kept you interested in it? Yeah.
It was a very clear decision on my part not to be a clinical psychologist because I'm much more interested in becoming than I am in the antecedents of how we got to where we are now. And so a great deal of my work, whether it's organizational or working with people after 50, it has been about their becoming.
I like that a lot, that whole idea of really being and not just doing anymore, but growing more whole, really. So let me ask you, given that my work and platform is Revolutionize Retirement, what is it about revolutionizing the concept of retirement? What's happening that really grabs your attention and should grab ours about the changing landscape of retirement?
I think retirement is revolutionizing itself, to tell you the truth.
I think that's a good way to put it.
It's changing under our feet, like magma shifting under the mountain. If you look at what retirement used to be pretty much consensually agreed on as you reached a certain age and you didn't work anymore. Maybe you had a dinner and a gold watch, and there was some period of years in which you could kick back and have leisure time, the golden years, if you will. And I think none of that works for most people anymore. They can't afford it. They don't want it. We don't have time. We're going to live longer, and we have to decide if we're going to add years onto the end of our lives or put them in the middle. We have lots of choices to make.
And do you find that people welcome that or tend to get really frightened and overwhelmed?
I think we get stuck in the word retirement. The opportunity we have to step outside the box, if you will, is limited by the language we have and the images we have. So if you take a look at the word retirement, it's still used as if we weren't going to work anymore. Some of us will, some of us won't. Some also take a couple of years off to recharge and then go back to work. It's also still used as if it were golden leisure time. If you just look at the retirement ads, they show shipboard and a middle-aged couple smiling at each other with a golf course behind them, or equally often, I think, an older man and a younger wife splashing in the surf somehow. So I think we have not yet come to grips with what retirement is, because it's no longer a stage of life. It's now a set of circumstances which are as individual as shoes. In the old days, you could say Apple or retirement, and everyone knew what it looked like. Today, you could say shoe or retirement, and no one will have a universal idea of what it looks like.
That's an interesting comparison. I like that. Can you say a little bit more about, I think that shoe metaphor is, you're right, they're different. There's no right way. It's really
That's right, and there's no right fit, even more importantly. Right. So if you and I went shoe shopping together, Dory, which I'd be happy to do, we might not have the same taste in style or texture or material or decoration or any of that, and yet we have to walk a long way in those shoes before we're done. I think the same thing applies to retirement. Retirement is not like Apple anymore. You say the word Apple, and I see Granny Smith, green. You say the word retirement to me in a modern sense, and I see an entire shoe store to be tried on and considered so that I find the right fit. And by the way, the right fit is not necessarily forever. I may have to wear the shoes for a while and discover that, this doesn't work for me anymore. I'll have to try a different style, and I try it on, and I walk in those.
So what's comfortable for me for a short time doesn't sustain itself and isn't comfortable.
No, it doesn't, because what's comfortable actually might not work in the long run.
Right.
In fact,
That's
frequently
a wonderful
what's comfortable, what's comfortable,
really
if our listeners will take a look at the many faces of retirement handout, I think I used the shoe and explained the shoe and Apple metaphor in that article. Not now, but I put it out there for them. And by the way, it was published as a blog on my site yesterday. So anybody who likes it or is interested in more information can go to the George Schofield website and simply sign up for more of the blogs when they'd like to.
That's great. I like people being able to have some action steps so that they can learn more from you. But yeah, I had read your handout, and really, you have some wonderful examples too of people just showing how the whole landscape has changed. I like you started out with talking about transitions, and I think about retirement as a transition. It's just not a destination anymore.
And in the old days, not so very long ago, when we talked about retirement, we immediately went straight to money. So frequently our relationships were all about planning for retirement, saving enough money, but we really didn't extend it out beyond that. I'm not a money person, a money professional, so I'm not going to talk about that as you and I are going along today, but I do have a recommendation, and that is when you're, that you find a professional advisor for money. Second of all, that you have a set of criteria by which you select. My wife's and mine were independent but affiliated, great reputation, walks the talk, one-stop shopping, meaning I didn't want to go to somebody for advice and then go somewhere else to buy securities, for instance. And in our case, my wife strongly preferred a woman. That's how we ended up with a wonderful Tracy Lamond, so that if something happened to me, no one would treat her as the little lady. She already was half the owner of everything we have.
That's such wonderful advice, to find somebody that you both are comfortable with, but also it is true, women are still, the gap's lessening a little, but women do still tend to outlive men. And
right.
It is so important to find somebody that you're comfortable with, that you trust, to help you manage the ups and downs.
And when you're in a crisis, if something happens to your partner, that's not the time to jump in and begin to learn. The time is now. Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you. That's really important. Maybe elaborate a little bit more, because I think in your first book, After 50, it's up to us, developing the skills and agility we'll need. That and many other things are sort of part of the book. Maybe before we even talk about what you've been learning for this new book, can you tell our listeners a bit about what you learned and what, how you were approaching things in this first book of yours? Sure. The book came about because, and not only am I an expert in this as you are, Dory, and not only do I write about it, but we're also living it. This isn't like I'm a travel agent who's never gotten on a ship and gone somewhere. This is my daily life, too. I started out with 2 boys. Now I have 7 grandchildren between the ages of 6 and 17. Is my life different? Yes. So when I began the original book, there were 2 catalysts for me. One was I was working with a fabulous professor named Argentine Craig, who really pushed my head, and because she wanted me to see that I had a future, but not necessarily the same as my past. My future wasn't not only going to not be an extension of my past, but some of the things I was good at, for instance, corralling kids, keeping a schedule, short order cooking, staying in a long-term job because that provided more security for my family than my going out on my own, which I did later. All of those things were wonderful skills I could use later in my life, but they were not all of them going to be the skills I needed in my future. And when I began to look for something that was a resource, I realized that it was up to me, because there wasn't anything like what I was looking for out there. And that's where the title came from, After 50, It's Up to Us. And so what were some of the things you learned? Because I think you're right. There's not been a roadmap, and I think those of us in the field have been trying to create the roadmap. Right. And there are some good role models. I know for a while it used to be thought, there aren't role models. There are some fabulous role models of people who navigated as well. Yeah. And the problem with the roadmap language is the same problem we have with the retirement language. If you pick up a roadmap or you turn on the GPS in your car, you can assume that where you start will remain constant, your destination will remain constant, and the path to get there will remain constant. I don't think any of those are true anymore. So I think not only are we struggling for new language and metaphors, I'm now suggesting, because I think there's a significant revolution in planning, that people have to plan in 3 perspectives: out to 18 months, 18 to 48 months, and then beyond 48 months. The closer to you in terms of the first 18 months, the more concrete you can make the plans. The further away from you, the less concrete you can make the plans. A lot of decisions won't stay made for the rest of your life, which comes as a great shock to people. And, I did that. I decided that. No, you decided that. It lasted about 8 years. That was a great run. You are happy in that house, but it's now time to move on because it has too many stairs for you, for instance.
It's a wonderful way of thinking about it. And you're right, language, it's just really interesting to think about it. Language is so important, and I hadn't put it together in terms of roadmap, but you're absolutely
images
right.
too. I actually was arguing with my editor originally because I wanted to use the highway metaphor more in the new book. And she wrestled me to the mat. Her name is Debbie Englander, and she's smart. She wrestled me to the mat and got me to admit that it wasn't about finding the map. It was about asking the question, how do I get there from here? When the destination may not remain the same and the route may not remain the same.
And there may be repairs in the road and detours and curveballs.
Absolutely.
All kinds of
I write about straightaways and hairpin turns that come out of nowhere. I would be very surprised if any of the 87 people out there listening to us had not had a hairpin turn or two in their lives.
And probably more coming up ahead, but yeah.
Yes, because we're coming into a period where we're familiar with continuous change. Continuous change is power windows instead of cranking the window closed in the old days. Continuous change is the disappearance, I'll use another car metaphor, of the knobs for the volume control and the channel control in my car, and I now slide my finger across a surface. Discontinuous change we don't know about because we haven't seen very much of it, but it is increasing. A business metaphor would be, or example rather, would be that Nokia thought it was in the phone business, and they sold lots of cell phones, and Apple came along and absolutely blew up the phone business. We didn't need home phones anymore, which affects the phone companies. A phone was a financial device. It was a camera. It was a binocular. I can use mine as a magnifying glass with a light. Apps galore. And the point of it is, if you were in the phone business and all of a sudden Apple came in with a device that did everything, plus it was a phone, your business would not be the same almost overnight. So one of the criteria for discontinuous changes, we probably don't see it coming, and it comes out of the blue, and we have to stop and pay attention to it to see what it is. Otherwise, we'll use the continuous change tools on discontinuous change, and it won't work.
That's such a great way of thinking about it, really. I think this is wonderful. I just also want to encourage people. I send in some questions or comments so that I can incorporate them for George as we continue his presentation. So talk more about the shift that you've experienced, I guess, doing the research for this book. And I think it sounds like using your own life experiences and probably from clients and colleagues and all.
Yes. It's the best way. I found that I reached a certain age and stage where I realized a couple of things had happened. One, I was no longer my chronological age. In fact, my chronological age didn't have much to do with anything.
Can you elaborate on that a little?
Sure.
Yeah.
I can today ride my bike 20 miles, and I couldn't have done that 15 years ago. That's upside down. But theoretically, I should be older and not able to do those things. I found that the limits that I had learned about and assigned to myself simply weren't true based on age. A 50-year-old should look like this and a 60-year-old should look like that. I interviewed a woman who was then 70 who had the experience of rolling down a grassy bank with her grandchildren. And her daughter at 45 came out of the house and said, "Mother, act your age."
I've heard of those kinds of comments.
One of the huge shifts for me was realizing that chronological age is not only not an effective metric anymore, it's actually disservice because it traps people. And I have been very careful as I've gone along to stop referring to my chronological age. Instead, talk about my interests and the things that I'm engaged with, because that's what's important to me. The second thing that really had to shift for me once I was freed up from that is I had to begin to realize and admit that not all of what I've been historically good at was going to serve me well down the road. If the people listening to, let's have a show of hands. I know I can't see you and you can't see me, but let's have a show of hands anyway. How many of you have walked around your house recently or gone out in your garage and said to yourself, "Why am I keeping that?"
My hand's up.
So that's been a metaphor for me, because I think that if I'm going to work at a very high quality later period in my life, then I can't start, say, at 68. Go back to developmental psychology. What makes a great 6-year-old a great 6-year-old? There are a lot of things, but the 6-year-old doesn't start at 5. The 6-year-old starts a lot earlier than that. What makes a great 70-year-old a fabulous person, a fabulous 70-year-old? Lots of things, but the person doesn't start at 69. It's an incremental process of acquisition and release and acquisition of release and paying attention to it. So that really fits into our discussion of retirement, because for me, had to give up the notion of retirement as a stage of life and a word I even wanted to use. Instead, in my own life, I have 5 major interests, one of which is my grandchildren, and I refer to them as my ponies on the track. And I water and ride and curry every one of them at some point during the week. 4 of them are businesses. One is my grandchildren. I'm active with them. But the big lesson for me was I don't want one great big thing that's going to own me anymore. I'd rather have several small things that I own that refresh and give me energy to do the other things. And it goes around in a circle.
Again, I think that's so helpful to think about and to recognize the options and the choices, but the intention and consciousness of what you need and what you want. And just not wanting to be tied to anything. I think about that when you were saying practicing entrepreneur.
Yeah, I've taken the training wheels off, but I'm still a little wobbly from time to time. And I've had to surrender something that I learned from my parents that's no longer true. After World War II, when we were in a growth pattern and things were relatively stable and incomes were going up and a whole variety of things happened, a plan was defined as how you get from here to there, and success was that you executed on the plan brilliantly and you ended up where you wanted to be on time. I don't think that's possible anymore. I think given the revolution in planning that you can plan in these 3 increments up to 18 months, up to 48 months, and then after that. But there are different kinds of plans and intentions, number one. And number 2, success is no longer, for planning, arriving at your destination and having executed on the plan flawlessly. I think planning success now is regular review, updating the plan based on the altered realities, and by the way, updating me given the altered realities also.
That's where I like the term optimistic realism, which is recognizing the change. But it's not my term. But I think Bill Sadler was the first person but I think a lot of people use it, but Bill Sadler introduced me to that term.
Invented a whole lot of great language. I'm lucky to be able to tap into him.
Yeah, no, he did. So I will integrate some questions from listeners also. But so you're talking a little about the kind of the notion of planning and these 18 months, 18 to 48 months, and then beyond 48 months. So can you talk a little about when does kind of, quote, retirement, again, knowing that the word is obsolete, but when does retirement planning end and where does life planning fit in?
It's interesting you should say that, because I actually had a wrestling match with the publisher, fine publisher. We debated about using the word retirement or the word life. I personally would like the word retirement to go away and instead talk about life planning. It's not realistic now, and we're not going to do it now because we don't have much to take its place. But in the new book, I talk about and I propose three, I hate the word stages, because then we go to, it begins here and ends there, and that's not how it is. Three periods of life. One is around 50, and I call it new freedom. The kids are going away. I've already made vice president. It's time. I'm going back to school. Whatever all those things are, I have more personal space than I've had in a long time. So that's new freedom. I think it's followed by new horizons, because I think, in my case, I had to get used to the freedoms first and then look up over the dashboard and go, oh my goodness, I could do that or that. So I entered a new horizons, what I call a new horizons period. It doesn't begin with a certain age. It doesn't end with a certain age. It's as individual as fingerprints. And then at the end of the new horizons, at some point, most people I know and that I interviewed for the book decided that they needed new simplicity. They didn't want the big house. They didn't want 3 cars. They didn't. Fascinating, and yet they were still current and active. They just didn't want all that stuff. I went to a lunch the other day, and the gentleman who was a former newspaper publisher on my left is 93. And when it was his turn to go around the table and talk, he talked about struggling to write an article for his Facebook page about his wife's recent death. Now, I ended up putting that in a blog, because I was so astounded that they'd gone to the new simplicity. He knew how he was focused. He didn't have all these other things. He was still writing a Facebook page, and he wanted to acknowledge to his Facebook friends that his wife had died and that he was okay. So if I look at those 3 stages, and they're not stages in the traditional sense of stage theory, which I am not, theorist, which I am not, if you go to new freedom, that's the shape you can work with and begin to plan. How would I use this new freedom? What would I do with it in the next 18 months? And eventually you'll come to new horizons. I don't want to be on those 7 committees anymore. I got interested in these other things. In my own case, I got interested in Ikebana, and I am now, after quite a few years, an Ikebana sensei, an Ikebana instructor. So I would not have imagined that in my own biography. And yet when I got to the New Horizons stage, it was really clear that I needed something that wouldn't allow me to multitask. And now I have 2 very strong things in my life that will not let me multitask. One is reading, and the other one is doing Sugetsu Ikebana, which is the Japanese art of floral design. Sugetsu is one of the Ikebana schools. I couldn't have anticipated that earlier. I couldn't have anticipated that at all until it came up over the horizon. Then I could adjust my plan, and I could adjust me. I'm sure down the road, Linda and I will move into the new simplicity era and go, okay, this has been a great house for us, and we've had a great run for a whole lot of years, but maybe this isn't the right fit for us anymore, and we'd much rather make some decisions that involve simplicity together now than have something happen to one of us and the other one is left holding the bag.
Again, it's being clear, intentional, and recognizing that there are going to be these changes ahead, it sounds like.
Absolutely. I called my consulting business the Clarity Group for a reason. Because
it makes sense to me now, as you're saying.
Click, yes. Yeah, so my standard line if I'm working with clients is, it's called Clarity for a reason. That does spill over into the work I'm doing on GeorgeSchofield.com, because the work on GeorgeSchofield.com is all about becoming in an intelligent, incremental way rather than the old way of having a plan and executing on it breathlessly and feeling like a failure if we didn't arrive at the end of the plan fully and perfectly executed. That's not realistic anymore.
I totally agree with you. I know in the book I co-wrote, we talk about a vision and a shared vision, but saying it's like a financial portfolio. You need to keep reevaluating it. It can't be written in stone because life changes and you change. And
so the last
otherwise
chapter
you just set up. Go ahead. No.
The last chapter in the new book is titled, "When Will I Be Done?" Because so often people have said to me, this was a lot of work, to which my answer is always not as much as if you hadn't done any planning at all would be. When am I done? I've been asked that so many times that I won't give away the content, but that's the final chapter in the new book.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the new book before I integrate these other questions?
Sure. It's going to be published by Amicom, which is the publishing division of the American Management Association. I started out with the notion of the book when I personally was struggling with the roadmap language, because I had the same problem then that I had earlier. When I was looking for a perfect model, I could just learn the 5 steps and poof, I'd be done. When I reached the stage that I realized I was going to have to invent a bunch of it for myself because it was as individual as my fingerprint, that's where the title After 50 It's Up to Us came from, because I was about 50. Now I realize that I'm still having a struggle, and a lot of my clients are having struggle because they're stuck in the roadmap, destination, equipment to take with you, metaphor, and I think that's not going to work for us. So I realized that in my own development and in the work I was doing with clients, I needed to shift and ask a smarter question. And those of you who are listening and work with me know I will regularly say the quality of the question drives the quality of the answer. So if that's true and it's how I run my professional life, then it was my job to help them ask better questions. An example of a bozo question for me would be, when can I retire? An example of a superior question would be, what would I like my life and me to be like in the first 5 years? So how can I get there from here was my attempt to use the where and get language but with providing new metaphors and new insights and new language so that my clients and my readers are not bound by the language that is and the images, by the way, that are no longer serving us well. It was an uphill struggle.
Say more about that if you could, and maybe include, because it sounds like part of the research and the process of the book was really yourself opening to new language and new ways to look at things.
Absolutely. I think for all of us who write, some of our best experiences come out of our own. Our life is a catalyst for how we think, if we're paying attention, if you will. So if I would give an example of my own learning from doing interviews, I went out to find out how planning was succeeding today and who was successfully planning. And what I discovered, and I did a lot of interviews, was almost no one was successfully planning. The major people who were successfully planning were people who could afford to buy their way out of anything and everything for the rest of their lives. The other 99.5% of us were going to have to revise our way of planning. So when Linda and I plan and we sit down at the end of the year to say, okay, what would we like the next year to be like? We have to say, okay, we can be concrete. Where do we want to live? Who do we want to be with? How do we want to spend our time? Where are we going to put our energy? How much private time are we going to have? Because we've gotten spoiled now in this New Horizons period. We have a reasonably large house, only 2 of us. When I go back to where we used to live in a dense city, to the condo that we still have, the rooms seem small to me because I wasn't accustomed to the personal space that I have now. I'm not willing to have a whole lot less personal space, and until we had this experience, I didn't realize how important personal space would be to me.
That's a wonderful example. Yeah, that's like the opening to what you learn about yourself in order to then go back and think about what do I need? So the criteria keeps changing, which is...
And I actually think learning about ourselves flies against the myth that once you're 35 and you're fully grown, you're cooked. I think that's completely unrealistic because given learning and information and expertise today, expertise and skills have a much shorter shelf life than they ever have in history. So I might know how to program something, but 3 years from now that won't work anymore. I might know how to run the dials and the buttons in my current car, but my next car 4 years from now might require me to learn all over again. I might have the notion that I can feel good if my children are in long-term jobs, when in fact the industries they've chosen aren't about long-term jobs at all. So learning to me, if I go back to the term lifelong learning, and I really believe in lifelong learning, I think it came from the notion originally that retired people needed to go back and have lots of interests. So I have friends long since retired who took a class in the history of opera, or the history of the Broadway musical, or how to navigate a ship, or whatever. They were stimulated by that, and they really enjoyed it. But it didn't, for the most part, challenge who they were and what they were skillful at. I think lifelong learning, along with retirement and a number of other things, are transforming under our feet so that lifelong learning is going to become an essential ingredient of how we live our lives, because our expertise and our skills will become stale dated at some point, and that's going to have a huge effect on our educational institutions because they can no longer graduate people on the assumption that their major will last the rest of their lives and there will be jobs for them based on their major.
That's so true. That's where the critical thinking, I think, comes in, and the love of just learning and learning new things, because that's the challenge, right?
So I actually think curiosity is one of the assets we have to carry forward. I recently wrote a blog that was an apology to, several years ago at a wine dinner, Linda and I met a man who was retired, and I asked him what he did and how he spent his time. And he said, I read. I go to the used bookstore and I buy myself 6 books, and I go home, and sometimes I sit on the patio and sometimes I sit in the house, but I read. And when I read my way through those 6 books, I trade them back into the used bookstore and I read 6 more. I was appalled. I couldn't imagine at that point in my life that this was an effectively grateful way for him or anyone to use their skills. But he triggered something for me, 2 things, one of which is I didn't give him permission to do what was right for him then. So by all I know, by now he's gone back and done a PhD in physics. That was the right fit for him at the time. The second piece of this is that I actually wrote a letter of apology to him. I don't know who he is or where he is, but I wrote a letter of apology to him because recently I, Mr. Multitasker, sat down to multitask in the cream-colored leather chair in our family room and looked at my stack of reading, and I never got out of the chair again for the rest of the day.
So you suddenly understood.
So as soon as I got up out of that chair, I wrote the man a letter of apology in one of the blogs on my website.
That's nice. The point you raise that's so important is what is right for somebody may not be right for you, but who are we to judge? And you may discover down the road that, wow, that makes perfect sense right now.
It sure caught up with me, I'll tell you for sure.
Yeah.
And on top of that, that then informs our planning, because I think we could certainly have long-term intentions. I'm not suggesting that we're just going to have blinders on at the 18-month mark. We shouldn't do that. But I distinguish between intentions, which are long-term expectations and intentions, and short-term commitments. I think we have, as a nation, a huge love of goals. And earlier in my life and earlier in a lot of my clients' lives, they were only as good as their goal achievement that year. I had a client who was a salesperson. One year, he was golden because he exceeded his sales quota by 50%. The next year, he was trash because he only made 98% of his goal. At this stage of our lives, there has to be some other way to anchor ourselves and our identities and our self-esteem that don't depend exclusively on roles like grandparent and goals. I think we need to take a look at our long-term intentions and use those as our North Star, and that's part of what I write about in the book.
I like that a lot. Long-term intentions as our North Star. So finishing up a little bit of the book, and then I'm going to integrate some of these other questions.
Sure.
What surprised you the most as you were interviewing people and writing this new book that's going to be coming out in July? You've mentioned a number of things already, but I just wonder, was there one or two things that really surprised you?
I think the thing I was surprised by, and to tell you the truth, I struggled with the most, is there were so many good answers that were not universally applicable and were not necessarily universally scalable. Everyone was finding the right fitting shoe with the right decoration for themselves. Could we give them information? Yes. Could we help them? Yes. Did we have to help them understand that the shoes that they picked for today may not be the right shoes 5 years from now? Yes. And so the thing that surprised me the most was, one, the diversity of the information, two, the fact it didn't scale from 5 people to 3,000 people, and that it was going to be less than permanent.
Very interesting. All right, I'm going to integrate. We have a couple of questions here, and I do want to encourage any others of you. Remember, as judged by me, the best question will get a copy of either George's current book or waiting for the new one to come out. So I encourage you to submit questions. So Elizabeth from Columbia has said, the term transition is used often to refer to a change, planned or unplanned, that disrupts the more stable episodes of life. It includes much disorientation before a new normal can be defined. I think this is why so many individuals stay away from making decisions about next steps until something somewhat forced to. How do we begin? So the part of the question is, how do we begin to socially construct a notion of this phase of life, which, as you say, may be repeated a few times as we find new shoes to try on, with some level of foreknowledge and or acceptance of the push and pull, ups and downs and uncertainty that will have to be encountered to make it to the other side?
Wow. Thank you.
Isn't that a great question?
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Let's begin with our historic, so the literature on transition. I believe the literature on transition framed things around a beginning, a middle, and an end. So in a way, it was tidy. If you were going to look at a transition, you would look for where it started, and you would look for what happened in the middle ground, and then you would look for the end of it. That's fine if you're doing one thing at a time and you begin with a clean beginning, a clean middle, and a clean end. I think that for most of us living busy lives, there's 6 things going on at once. We may have 6 beginnings, which overlap a little bit, but they're not utterly discrete from each other. We may have 6 middles, and we may have 6 ends. And I'll give you an example out of my own life. My oldest granddaughter is 17 and as tall as I am, and a fabulous young woman who has her own opinions. So the group of the kids and I went to a movie, and at the end, she put her hands on her hips and looked at me and said, "Okay, Papa, tell me what you really thought of the movie. We know when you're just being nice to us." That was a huge beginning for me, because I was not clear, because I was still living in my historic grandfather role, that this was going to happen. In the same week, her youngest sister, then 7, and Sarah and I were in the grocery store, and Sarah has 4 older sisters and a brilliant mother. Excuse me, she has 3 older sisters and a brilliant mother. So I turned to her and said, "Would you like to push the grocery cart?" Sarah, completely unaware of what I was saying. And Sarah said, "That's a lifelong dream, Papa." Now, where would a 7-year-old get the language for a lifelong dream? So we're going down the aisle, and she tugs on my sleeve and said, Papa, I want you to know, I know you're going to die someday, but not for a long time, like at least 2 years. I put this in the blog too. The example I'm trying to give is within a week, I had 2 of these beginnings. The younger one was beginning to grasp concepts that will force me to change how I grandparented verb transitive her. And the oldest one also gave me information which suggested that I really needed to back off and give her a whole lot of space, and when she's ready, she'll come back around. There was a middle to that too, but it's the most concrete example I can give you out of my own personal life, out of almost concurrent overlapping beginnings and, in a way, endings too, because the 7-year-old was no longer a little girl to me anymore. I'm not sure that I answered the brilliant question, but I think that we have to transform our notion of transition from a simple beginning, middle, and end, one-offs, one at a time, to this sort of thing that looks more like a whirling dervish, where you have to pay real close attention to which was a beginning, which was a middle, and which was an end as they rotate.
That is very helpful and important to think about. It underscores, it does make me realize the importance of language. I just had given a talk where I used transition, and I must say I wasn't thinking about all these multiple simultaneous transitions. I was just thinking that life is just a series of them, but you're right, that there can be many going on all at the same moment, all at the same time.
Exactly.
So two questions from the same person who didn't identify her or himself, so I can't say who it's from. So the first one is, I love what I've heard. I'm wondering if part of the simplicity phase stage is simplifying not just our stuff, but our schedules and our choices to boil down to the most important priorities and to distill our personalities to our essences.
I have a 2-word answer. Heck yes. That's brilliant.
Right.
Absolutely brilliant.
Right.
Because the fact is that in a lot of cases, we have already ticked a lot of things off the list. One of the worst things that ever happened to me as an American male was that, whether it was intended or not, I had this list at birth of things I needed to accomplish. And the worst day of my life was the day when I suddenly realized I had checked everything off the list. And the level of responsibility I had for my life escalated 3,000% because I could no longer do things because I had to just check it off the list and get the next flag of the next mountain. If I wasn't happy, it was because I was pursuing something that I myself had chosen, not because someone else had chosen it for me. And I got to tell you, that was not only painful, but highly enlightening. And that was when my own simplification began.
It's amazing the ways that sometimes we have these epiphanies of, that's what it is. Yeah. All right, another question from the same person who says, I'm also interested in the potential role of the wise elder in our society, including the inner work, Rabbi Zalman Schechter Shalomi's saging process and mentoring the younger generations, which seems to me to be even more critical at this post-election time. Have you found anything like this in your interviews or in your own experience?
I would completely agree with the importance of the elders. I would, however, depart from the notion that mentoring is top-down only. What I discovered, among other things, was that each generation must mentor the one below and above it, because I'll go back to my 17-year-old granddaughter, who I think is just fabulous. She needed to teach me some things, including some technology things that I would not have known otherwise. I needed to teach her some social things or give her some opportunities she would not have had otherwise. I think that we need to move the model from exclusively top-down to a multi-generational, multi-directional model because of the reduced... I've lived a long time. I believe I have wisdom because of that, but I'm also aware there's a limit to my wisdom because I'm not living in the world that my children or my grandchildren are. So I think that there's a certain shelf life to and limit to my wisdom simply because I'm older. I don't think that buys it anymore for me. I think we all have wisdom, and we need to mentor each other. And I'll give you an example. When my grandchildren are here without their parents, which we've been doing every summer for a number of years now for a portion of the summer, we have a ritual where everybody, no matter how old they are, and they have to be 6 before they can come, sits at the table before dinner and talks about what was the most interesting part of their day. Not what did they like the best, not what was difficult, not what was painful, none of that. We had the ritual of everyone had to go around the table. We all had to go around the table, and everyone had to answer the question. The answers were astounding over a period of time, and in that way I was trying to build non-intrusive device, if you will, for everyone to be able to mentor everyone else without making it a heavy-duty thing.
And I must say, the last two questions, I must say I was pretty sure it was from Meg from Weston, Massachusetts, and she confirmed that the questions were from her. And she
That's
added...
That's the Meg I know. She's wonderful.
That's the Meg, and she is wonderful.
And she's wonderful. Okay.
And she says, in regard to your idea of the two-way mentoring, she says, I completely agree with your qualification about two-way mentoring. The millennials probably have the most to teach us. We need to work together. And I totally agree with that, too.
I do, too. So I love the question. And by the way, whether it's a rabbi or a minister or a grandfather or someone who's avuncular, I don't know what the ant word for avuncular is, so we'll tuck ant in under that with uncle. There's no doubt that's necessary, and it's really crucial that they're involved one-on-one time. So it's not enough for me to be with all my grandchildren in a clump. I also have to make sure that I have high enough quality one-on-one time with them, because that's where some of the really important mentoring happens also.
And I'll put a plug in for this Encore.org. It's starting this new Generation to Generation program. I know it's being launched here in Boston on December 12th, I think. And it's really looking at the two-way street, in a way, of the mentoring. And I know Jan Hively talks so much about age-friendly cities that need to be age-friendly for all ages, and the importance of people learning from each other and working together. There's so many possibilities. Absolutely, please.
You triggered something by saying age-friendly cities.
Yeah, sure.
And so this is just the viewpoint according to George, not to be confused with the truth.
Okay.
I think that in the process of doing so many wonderful things for, quote, seniors, unquote, housing, transportation, no architectural barriers, entertainment, engagement, healthcare, all of stimulation, all of these things, for me, that's only half of the yin and the yang, or the half of the circle. The other half is all those years after 50 where we had an opportunity to grow and change and develop ourselves so that by the time we reached the stage that we could really avail ourselves of senior-friendly cities and senior-friendly services, we arrived at that condition, if you will, having done a lot of the work ourselves in terms of growing ourselves, because I don't think, say, between 50 and 80, I'll just make up a number, is a period where we're just coasting along. I think that's a huge developmental platform for us, which leads us straight into and affects the quality of our later years.
I think that's crucial, and I think it's true. It's that notion of these bonus years that we have. It's not all just being old. It's how we kind of use and grow and learn and give back throughout as us, or build us, I guess. Yeah.
In all honesty, that's the audience I'm writing for. I'm not writing for a specific age person. I'm writing for the people in a period of life who are going to have to make the huge leap from, I've worked all these years, I have a pension, I'll be just fine, to, wait a minute, I'm going to live either a long time or a short time longer. I'm going to have some senior years. I want to use those years in between as a developmental platform because it has a direct bearing on the quality of who I am and how I live later. And that's the group of people for whom I am writing.
That sounds so important. I know I'm seeing the time and realizing we are getting near the end, but I have a couple more questions I want to ask you. And you had said,
sure.
I just have another comment from somebody. Let's see. From Maura from Paris, writes, no question, just appreciation for the broadening of my perception. Really provocative metaphors. Excellent contribution to the new language we so badly need to fit our growth into our upcoming successive phases of life. I think that's very true. Thank you, Maura. But so tell us a little, what do you imagine for yourself, for your own, I don't know what word to use, next phase, retirement, new shoes?
I would have to admit I don't have a word for it either. It's the next period in my life, but it's not like stepping over a threshold into a new room. It's more like a Venn diagram where I'm in a circle and I pass through where they overlap into the next area, if you will. I am entering, I believe, the new simplicity period, not because of a certain age and not because of I'm overwhelmed and not because I have health needs. I simply have come to a point in my life where I'm very interested in quality. I've noticed that as I am getting older, time alone is something that I prize that I would not have prized earlier in my life. So that's an ingredient. A funny story, my wife was going to her high school reunion, and we had this big joke going because I didn't want to go so I could stay home alone, because neither one of us could remember the last time I was alone in the house overnight. And that was fine. That was fine with her too. But I grabbed a time where I could be alone in the house. It was phenomenal for me because in my work, I travel so much that I'm usually the one who's gone. So it would be time alone. It would be space that living space that we really love. It would be propinquitous community. Propinquity is connection through physical adjacency. And we live in a beautiful area with reasonably large houses and large lots. I think that down the road, this is not going to be propinquitous enough for us, and we're going to need to find some other way. We haven't found it yet, but we're going to have to find some other residential living format. Another would, for me, be enough arts, because I'm an arts person, except for opera. And I would say that the rest of it's going to flow from my ponies on the track. I have some rental properties. I manage the managers. I write and publish. I do organizational consulting. I'm one of the experts in the back of What Color is Your Parachute, which is the #1 career-selling book in the world. So I end up doing career work with people. And the last pony is my friends and my children and grandchildren. And I think there's enough mix and enough diversity among all of those that would make for the rich kind of life toward which I think Linda and I are moving. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a heartfelt personal response.
No, it's a wonderful response, and I think speaks to the fullness and richness of life. I always say I'm influenced by positive psychology, and well-being says connection, engagement, and purpose and meaning, and you've built in all of that in a very full, heartfelt way. So what haven't we talked about that you think our listeners should hear before we close today?
I think we haven't talked about isolation enough, if at all.
Yep. Yeah, we haven't at all. You're right.
When I went for my later in life...
Are you there?
You didn't lose me. I got so excited I waved the phone and dropped it. When I was working on my dissertation with the fabulous Argentine Craig, part of my dissertation was a study of social networks. And if you look at and by the way, I have this prejudice, I think that the media and social networking has hijacked the intelligent language around the literature of social network analysis. Because if I go to a Chamber of Commerce meeting here and people are busy handing out business cards, they think they're networking. Social network analysis is about studying and measuring the quality of the connection between people. If somebody just hands me a business card, there is no quality of connection. So if you can follow this then, I'm very concerned about the quality of our connections, effect on decision-making, level of trust, amount of sort of psychic nutrition we get from each other, shared history, openness for difference among us, and different opinions. Those would be characteristics of the connection, some of the characteristics of connections between us. It seems to me that as we grow older and our friends move away to be closer to their children, or someone dies, or someone becomes ill or immobilized and is less available to us, we fail to rebuild our networks. So, or replenish our networks. The only way we're going to be able to replenish those dear, tight, close networks is by having relationships with people we don't know so well, and spending time with people we don't know so who have ideas other than the ideas that we have. Because from that exposure will come the candidates, not only are those important in their own right, but from those loose connections, as it's called in the world of social network analysis, come the candidates for the replenishment of our strong connections, those people that are in our inner core. And there's a paradox here, because often the people in our inner group, our strong connections, can even finish our sentences, but they are not the source of new ideas. So if I'm working with a career client, I will ask that career client to go network out, to talk to people that he or she doesn't know, because that's usually where the new and necessary information is. So we need our strong networks, but we also need our loose networks of people we don't know as well. One, for new ideas and stimulation, but two, because otherwise we have no candidates to replenish our strong networks as people die or move away or whatever, and isolation occurs as a result. I think the work of maintaining and replenishing networks is essential to this period in our lives, so that we have the skill and the connections for use now and later.
I think that's such an excellent point, and you're right that we hadn't talked about that at all, and it's often not talked about. It really does, in this funny way, remind me of when I was a Girl Scout, make new friends and keep the old. One is silver and the other is gold. But,
I remember.
But that whole, you remember that too.
I could even sing it, but I'll spare you.
Yeah, I was going to do that too, and I thought, no, let's not do that. But it's so true, and it's so hard sometimes for people when they get older of thinking of, again, the ending or the losses, and yet how nourishing and can play into one's excitement about the world, new ideas, curiosity to meet new people and talk about and be open to new ideas, whether it be people of the same age or other age, tied into what we were saying before.
It also means, I believe, really taking a close look at our need for control. Because it seems to me that if we are unable to dial down our need for control, we are going to be correspondingly less able or likely to go out and meet other people with different ideas that we'll need later in our lives.
Said. I think that's a good place to pull it together and end. I hope that you will come back again. This has just been so wonderful, George. But
sure.
You want to mention them again?
I'm George Schofield. George, no punctuation, Schofield, Schofield. You'll find the books in the book under the book tab and at georgeschofield.com. I would encourage you, if you've enjoyed this time and benefited from it, to go to the home page to just below the center and click subscribe and send your email address. You will, of course, receive an email asking you to confirm that you did this so that somebody else isn't signing you up. And you'll need to remember to complete that process. Other than that, I would look forward to more conversation. And all of us, we're a community studying this, and we're pioneers developing this. So the more people can read my blogs and respond to them, and I can be on Dorian's show, and Meg can write what she writes, and we build an organization and contribute to each other, I think that's where we have to go.
Great. Thank you again so much. And I should say Elizabeth wrote thanks with many exclamation marks. Thank you again. And
you're welcome.
Be well, everybody, and talk to you soon. Take care.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio with Dr. Dorian Mintzer. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show, listen to past episodes, or download our free retirement transition guide, visit revolutionizeyourretirementradio.com.